This video is sponsored by the Luminous Lore Kickstarter. Do you ban any spells in your 5e games? This is another installment in my Worldbreaker series where I take a look at some aspect of D&D that some GMs choose to ban, and I talk about why you might or might not decide to allow these options in your own games. I believe this is the last installment that will be based on the mechanics of 2014 D&D. I do have one more of these that I'm working on, focusing on something else that players can choose when they're creating their characters, but that one will be less tied into the mechanics of D&D 5e. But that's why I wanted to at least get through this video before September when the D&D rules are going to change. Because I generally don't ban any spells in D&D 5e, but that answer might change come September when the new Player's Handbook drops. But as it stands right now, I wanted to take a look at some of the most common spells that get banned in D&D 5e and look at why you might choose to ban them. I'll offer my explanations for why I don't tend to ban these spells, but my goal is not to convince you of what you should or shouldn't do, just to offer my perspective and hope that it helps you make up your mind one way or the other. However, there is something important that we should make sure we establish before we continue. As the Dungeon Master, it is absolutely your call to decide which spells your players will be allowed to select. If there's a spell you don't like because you feel it breaks the game by making it less fun for the players, or it doesn't fit with the D&D world you've created, or it will undercut the adventures that you want to run, that's certainly your decision to make. That being said, you absolutely need to tell your players this before character creation. In the next month or two, I'm going to make a video where I create a character starting with a spell as the inspiration, using that spell, whatever spell it winds up being for the purposes of the video, but using that as the jumping off point for the entire character concept. But imagine if I did that, I got through the character creation process and maybe even played a few sessions before I discovered that you don't allow that spell to be used in your games. I would be pretty frustrated. And you could say, well, I'm the DM, it's my call to decide what spells are allowed in the game or not, and it would absolutely be true. But that's not magically going to make me not have a bad time when a spell I've been looking forward to casting is now totally off the table with basically no notice. If there's a spell you're planning on omitting from your game, tell your players before they make their characters. Now, it is also possible that you don't think a spell is going to be a problem. Or, you maybe just haven't sat down and reviewed all the spells and you don't know what they all do yet, because it's actually pretty unreasonable to assume that any DM should have an encyclopedic knowledge of the rules of this game. But either way, for whatever reason, you don't warn the players about a spell simply because it's not on your radar. And then, as the game plays out, you start realizing that the spell is going to be an issue. In fact, that it has become an issue. You have the authority to just nix it from the game, but I would really recommend you talk it through with your fellow players. You should be able to explain your position and hopefully win them over to your side, but you should also listen to them. They might totally understand and say, yeah, it has felt like we've been getting away with something whenever we cast this spell. It makes the game way too easy for us. On the other hand, they might love the spell, and so losing out on it would be a huge blow to where they find the fun in the game. So again, talk it through with them. You should be able to find some sort of compromise that works for everybody. For example, maybe they ask you not to ban the spell, so in exchange, you propose just toning down the damage, or making it cost a higher level spell slot, or decreasing the range so it can't be used from such a far distance that it makes the game less tense and less fun, because now they're no longer just sniping their enemies at range as soon as they enter the battlefield, which means not only were your players not getting to do anything fun, but your melee characters were also being left out as well. But I'm personally of the opinion that you can alter your tactics rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater by banning a spell. We'll talk about that later in this video, and maybe I'll even elaborate on that in a future bonus video sometime in the next month or two. There is a D&D spell that I basically soft ban, or at the very least I gate away from my players a little bit. And we'll talk about that a bit later in the video. But while I'm going to ask you to wait to hear about the spell that I ban, one thing I don't want you to wait on is the Luminous Lore Kickstarter. We're in the final days of this campaign to produce this 5e supplement that brings the world of dreams to life. The book features new character options including new subclasses, new ancestries, new spells, and a brand new system of dream magic. You also get 25 NPCs, 55 dream and godly artifacts, 45 dream monsters, and godly avatars that your party can challenge in combat. And you can help bring the world of Luminous Lore to your games. Check out the Kickstarter link in the description below and check out the campaign, but make sure to act now because there is not much time left to sign up. Thank you again to the Luminous Lore Kickstarter for sponsoring this video. Check them out in the links below. The first spell we're talking about today is Guidance. And personally, I feel like I've seen the frustration with Guidance grow a lot over the past few years, around the same time as the cast of Critical Role started using it a whole lot. That might be a coincidence, or it might just be because I make a lot of Critical Role videos, and so I get a lot of Critical Role viewers in my comments, and that does impact how they talk about the game. But the overwhelming issue I see discussed with Guidance has very little to do with the power level of the spell itself, but much more to do with player etiquette. In a perfect world, your players would see that they're about to enter an exploration scene, like they're going to be searching a library for information or examining the tracks of a foe, and as it's clear this is what they're doing, that's when another player will say, I'm casting Guidance. However, very often a player will instead make a roll, or they'll ask the GM a question, the GM will ask for a roll, and that's when another player character will say, guidance. And if this bothers you, I totally understand. However, speaking personally, I don't think it's necessary to ban the spell for this. This is more about establishing clear protocols around casting spells. Generally speaking, it's reasonable to say, hey, you hadn't said you were casting a spell, so you can't now say that they get the benefits of a spell. That being said, I also understand why players do this with guidance specifically. There are times where it would be obvious to the player characters that one of their party members is about to try something that might benefit from guidance. For example, let's say the party comes to a locked door. The rogue says, does it seem safe to open? And the GM says, make an investigation check. And then the cleric jumps in with, hey, I cast guidance on you. Well, you might argue, they didn't say they cast guidance before, but the characters in the world, they would probably have time to react and cast a spell. They would see the rogue bending down and examining a lock, whereas the player didn't necessarily have that same advanced notice that their GM was going to say, make an investigation check. So that's what I try to keep in mind during my games. When a player says, I'll cast guidance on you, I think about what the characters of the world of the game are actually seeing and how they're able to react. For example, if someone is checking a lock for traps or looking around for tracks, I'm happy to let a guidance spell sneak in. However, if somebody asks, do we know anything about the Duke of Damnation? And I say, make a history check, a player might say, guidance, and I'll respond, you haven't seen him do anything. We're just seeing if the name triggered any memory for him. There's nothing he'd be doing that would prompt you to cast that spell on him. Now, I don't mind doing that because I'm already constantly thinking about what the events in the game world would actually look like to the people who live in that game world. So it basically requires no additional effort from me. But if you don't like the fact that one spell might demand you to do a bunch of extra work, especially if it doesn't already mesh with your playstyle the way it does for mine, then I can certainly understand if the simpler solution is just to ban it from your games outright. Next, let's discuss comprehend languages. This one surprised me when I saw that some DMs banned this spell, and I fully hate this spell. I suppose I can see the logic here. DMs don't like spells that cut through their mysteries too quickly. I think this has a lot to do with how we perceive mystery stories in other media, and our expectations for how we hope a mystery will play out at the table, and how those ideas often come into conflict with the way a game like D&D actually works. For example, in a movie, when the characters find a note written in another language, they probably have to take it somewhere to translate it. They don't just take a minute and magically know what it says. I mean, nowadays they would. They could just pull out their phone and run the note through an app to translate it, but that's one of the many reasons writers hate cell phones, because they just make so many situations a lot less dramatic. But that's essentially what the Comprehend Languages spell does. It's a translation app. And someday I'm going to make a video about how we should reprogram our brains and change the way we approach mysteries in our D&D games, precisely because the way players behave makes a traditional mystery structure a lot harder to pull off. But even setting aside the fact that I think about mysteries differently than maybe some other GMs do, I don't mind this spell in general. Comprehend Languages is fun because players like being rewarded for the choices they made at character creation. It makes them feel like they did something right, and in a daunting game like D&D, where there are so many options and no right answers, it's a really powerful experience to be able to say, wait, I have the perfect spell for this. In truth, I actually wish my party had the cause to use this spell more often. I really should give my party more old tomes or maps with notes in languages their characters don't know. And then if the players use that spell, they'll feel rewarded for choosing that spell. And if they don't have the spell, they'll need to try to find a way to read the language, which can act as a plot hook for a future adventure or a quest, and that's also extremely valuable. I think the common trap GMs fall into is that they expect to get to that adventure where the players have to find someone to decode the letter, and then the players bypass that content by casting this spell. And I can absolutely understand why that's frustrating. However, again, I think maybe I just think differently about how running the game should work, because I think there's something fun about players bypassing a bunch of my content because they cast a spell. After all, that's the fantasy behind having magic. It allows you to take shortcuts and make your life easier. And spoiler alert, but that's gonna be kind of the same reason why I don't ban a lot of these spells. Next up is Goodberry, and I've referenced it before, but Goodberry is the type of spell that can absolutely hamstring a game where you're trying to make travel and exploration tense. Z Bashu made a great video proposing a solution where the material components are consumed by the spell, which at least makes tracking down those material components a little bit more of a challenge, and this can be a really nice solution. However, this is definitely one of those times where I think that you should really explain your reasoning to your players in advance. Because if your goal is to run a campaign where resource management isn't just important, but is actually the entire point of the game, then that's something your players really need to know. Because not everybody sits down to play D&D in the same way. Some people just want to clock in, kill some monsters, and clock out. Others just want a heroic fantasy game where they get to be Aragorn or Luke Skywalker, and they don't want to have to think about their inventories too much. And there is absolutely an argument that if you want to run a game with a heavier emphasis on survival, D&D 5e might not be the best system to do that. I'm not saying that you couldn't still run that game in 5e and have fun, but if you choose to run that kind of adventure in another game system, then it will just be a lot more clear to your players what kind of adventure they should expect. That way, they'll know whether or not they're at the right table. Still, if you want to ban this spell just for a specific adventure or in a specific setting, you can totally do that. The move to make the material components more important might be a more elegant solution, but that does not mean that it's the only solution. The next spell on my list is Identify, and this feels like a strange one to me until I consider that the folks banning this spell are probably also banning another rule. See, I believe the folks who ban Identify are doing so because they want the world to feel more low magic, more mysterious. They don't want the players to simply cast a spell or perform a 10-minute ritual and know nearly everything they need to know about an object. But aside from the fact that I think moments like that feel really good if the party has taken that spell, I am personally leaning much more toward making Identify a requirement for getting all the information on a magic item. Because in 5e as it stands right now, Identify is basically optional, or arguably a waste of a spell. In the rules, a player character can take a short rest and identify a magic item without casting a spell. Sure, Identify is an action to cast, so you can use it to figure out what a magic item does if you aren't able to take a short rest. But most of the time, I see the spell being cast as a ritual, which requires 10 minutes, so functionally, it is often incorporated into the character's short rests. And personally, I am really starting to like the idea of not letting players figure out how a magic item works over a short rest. That being said, if you ban Identify, you probably also don't allow your players to figure out all of a magic item's secrets over a short rest. It seems like it wouldn't make a lot of sense to get rid of one very convenient way to identify items if you're going to allow the other. So maybe they make the players work to figure out how a magic item works within the world of the game. I'm not sure. But I don't tend to go that far, because I think that requires more of my energy to track what the players know about the item and what they haven't figured out yet. I don't mind doing some of that, but doing it constantly would be a lot of work for me. Plus, doing it constantly would mean that once I know the players have figured out everything there is to know about a magic item, they don't necessarily have any way of knowing that's the case. So they might keep testing the item and asking me questions, and I don't have a way to tell them, no, you're good, you know everything there is to know about this item now. I also like the tradition that Matt Colville discusses in so many of his videos where players have to go back to civilization or find the local wizard and get their magic items identified. I have mixed feelings about having NPC allies as spellcasters, and I really do need to make my video about that subject soon. But my major issue with that trope is all the various implications that come from having these high-level spellcasters sit back and watch low-level adventurers handling the problems of the world. But Identify is only a first-level spell, so the player's wizard ally doesn't need to be very high-level to help cast this spell and help them out in this regard. Plus, going to talk to the local wizard means returning to civilization, which can expose them to other plot hooks. They can hear rumors about other adventurers, NPCs can make requests to the party. Going to talk to the wizard essentially helps push the story forward. And once again, we have a situation that might be a bummer if your players bypass all of your prepped content by casting a spell, but again, I think that just makes the players feel smart for choosing the right spells. You could also split the difference like Matt Mercer did in the Vox Machina campaign when Grog picked up Craven Edge. He got a card with some information on it which seemed to represent what he could figure out about the sword after taking a short rest and or testing out the item for a while. But at the end of that storyline, he got a magic item card with a lot more information on it, which Matt told them he would have been able to learn in character if he'd had someone cast Identify on the sword. But the issues with this method might seem obvious to you. First, you're making 2 item cards, one of which might be incomplete, so that's extra work. But second, if you hand your players a magic item card, they might not have any reason to think that there's any additional information that's hidden from them that they don't have. That's why I'd recommend being extremely clear that this isn't all the information. But again, speaking personally, I'd much prefer just allowing the players or NPCs to cast Identify. I have no problems with that spell. Now we come to one that is really contentious. Healing Spirit. And I have a lot of thoughts about this one, because the moment this spell was published in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, it was so obviously broken. Anyone could pass through a Healing Spirit on their turns and regain 1d6 hit points. So if you cast it out of combat, your entire party can just run through it in a circle, and over the course of 1 minute, they'd gain 10d6 healing. Additionally, you can move the spirit on your turn, and the spell says it heals whenever a creature enters the spirit or starts their turn within it. And the way we read it, that included any time the spirit moved through you, which meant that you could send the spirit back through that circle of party members and then heal an additional 10d6 over the course of a minute. We didn't even roll the dice most of the time because the minimum healing of 20 hit points was usually enough to bring our 3rd and 4th level characters back up to full. Now, these days I would not rule that the spell works that way because the spirit healing you whenever it enters your space wouldn't work for the same reason that damaging spells, like Moonbeam, aren't intended to harm you when the spell first hits you, and also to harm you at the start of your turn, because that would be an unintended doubling of the impact of the spell. But not having that errata at the time, that's how we read the spell at the time, and I doubt we were the only ones. But even without that extra powerful interpretation, it is still a second level spell that can deal out 10d6 healing a minute if you're strategic about it. And if you cast it at higher levels, you get an extra d6 of healing for each level you upcast it, so it's always going to be pretty powerful. So they very quickly reprinted it. So now it reads, the spirit can heal a number of times equal to 1 plus your spellcasting ability modifier, minimum of twice. After healing that number of times, the spirit disappears. And now the spell is much better balanced and much less broken. Cowards. Look, this is absolutely not how you have to play your game. Obviously, if a spell is that wildly powerful at low levels, it's going to make the entire game much easier for the players, and it's going to reduce the tension. Yes, I agree. I hear you. But also, I enjoyed the challenge. I didn't mind throwing mighty enemies at my players because I knew they could handle it. I told them, hey, you can give your character Healing Spirit, but I'm going to keep that in mind when I'm building encounters. I'll design them with the knowledge that you could potentially heal up to full with a single spell slot in between battle. Healing Spirit was also a trap. Oh, so you don't want to take a short rest and potentially recover some other resources? You instead want to spend a spell slot and keep adventuring? Okay, twisting my arm, why don't you? It was actually great in encouraging the players to keep going even when they probably shouldn't. Players are usually pretty risk-averse, so any spell that encourages them to keep adventuring was honestly not the end of the world for me. But the players did feel like they were getting away with something. I think that they ultimately stopped casting it in future campaigns because it just wasn't that fun for them. But I tried to make it clear that, no, they weren't getting away with anything. I knew exactly what Healing Spirit was capable of. Well, we were wrong, but I thought it was more powerful than it actually was. But I welcomed them to use it. I basically told them that casting the spell out of combat was their way of letting me know that they were ready for more challenging combats.
It is a signal to all the realms that the Earth is ready for a higher form of war.
Next, I want to talk about Counterspell, because this is kind of a strange one. So the most common reason cited for banning the spell is that it's not fun for the players. They're playing mid-level D&D, they spend at least 15 minutes waiting for their turn in combat, though that's honestly the best case scenario, it could be way longer. Then their turn comes around and they finally get their chance to act, and they cast a spell that they've been looking forward to for most of the session. And then, your spellcasting NPC waves their hand and says, nope, you don't get to do anything after all, sucks to suck. And then the player just has to sit and wait for their next turn, which could be another 15 minutes, but actually more likely 20 to 30 minutes, let's be honest. And all the time, they're thinking, maybe soon I'll actually be able to contribute to this game. Now, first of all, that is absolutely a valid criticism of Counterspell. Like, fundamentally, that is how the spell works. This doesn't mean that every table has quite so negative an experience of the spell, of course. If you watch Critical Role, you know that plenty of players have had their spells countered by enemy combatants and enemy spellcasters, and while it might be a really bad thing to happen, it's very rare that the player actually seems to feel, in real life, frustrated by it. My guess is that this is because these players tend to be really invested in each other's turns, so they're not just passively waiting for their own turn to act, they're actually invested in the whole fight. However, this is just a note for my fellow critters. Just because some of the best moments in Critical Role involve the spell Counterspell, that doesn't mean that other groups at other tables haven't had bad experiences with the very same spell. Like I said, it is absolutely accurate to say that the spell, by design, shuts down a player's turn when they get counterspelled. If somebody doesn't like that, it kind of doesn't matter how amazing any given counterspell on Critical Role was, what a great moment it led to. So bugging them about that isn't going to change their opinion, and it doesn't really help. This issue with the spell is also why there are so many different versions of Counterspell out there to offer an alternative you can use in your own games. It's why so many of the designers of this new run of Dragon Slayer games often reference Counterspell as something that sucks because it robs the players of a chance to do something meaningful with their turn. But also, counterpoint, if your players don't like getting counterspelled, then stop giving your NPCs Counterspell. Like, if that's how the table feels about the spell, then just stop using it for your NPCs. Because I don't think the spell is broken or badly damaged when it's being used by players. It shuts down spells of equal or lower level and has a chance of shutting down any spell, but there's also a chance of failure. It's not guaranteed to overpower an NPC. And I personally think it's a good risk reward for a player because it doesn't cost an action or a bonus action. You're not investing a huge chunk of your turn into this effort. It's a reaction spell. If it fails, you're down a spell slot, but otherwise the situation is the same as it would have been if you hadn't cast the spell. But the issue most tables seem to have with the counterspell is when it's used by the villains. So if that's how your table feels, then just don't have your villains use it? Like, sorry, is it me? Or is this actually kind of a non-issue? Now, if you still want an alternate version of Counterspell, that's totally valid. I also think it is absolutely reasonable to come up with alternate versions of Counterspell that are specific to your villains, so when they cast a spell on a hero, it doesn't completely ruin their turn. Or maybe you only use Counterspell sparingly, or you only use Counterspell when you know that one of your other player characters has Counterspell themselves and can try to counter your counter. Or you save it for the nastiest villains to reflect how evil they are. There are plenty of options to make Counterspell less of an issue for your NPCs to cast on your player characters. But when a hero casts Counterspell on a villain, that should be a risky moment that actually has a chance of completely ruining your villain's turn, because that's fun for a player. You're the GM, you get to play as many characters as you want during a fight, and when your characters die, you'll get a chance to play more characters whenever you want. Losing a turn to Counterspell doesn't have anywhere near the same psychological impact on a GM as it does for a player. So like I said, I don't ban Counterspell because I don't see the need. I totally get it if you feel differently, and I certainly understand if you don't like it when a spell is designed to be fun for a player to cast, but wildly unfun for them to be the target of the spell. But the players and the GMs are always having different experiences, so I don't tend to lose a lot of sleep over asynchronous design. That's why this argument over Counterspell has just never really made a whole lot of sense to me, since it does seem like there is such a obvious solution to it. But again, if you disagree, fair enough, let me know in the comments below. Next we're going to talk about Speak with Dead. And like with some of the other spells we've discussed, it seems like the most common reason I've seen for why this gets banned is because it gets in the way of telling a mystery story. Who killed this person? Oh, let's ask the victim. Oh, they said the butler did it. That was easy. Now, like I said, we'll probably need to talk in the future video about rethinking mysteries in D&D, because if you know anything about mysteries, you know that finding out who the killer is doesn't mean the story is over. But even setting that aside, running a mystery in D&D is hard enough without removing one of the player's methods for finding evidence. It's hard for the players to find witnesses sometimes. I don't think there's anything wrong with questioning the corpse. The first time I ever saw an example in fiction of something a lot like Speak with Dead, it was in the pilot for Torchwood, and the corpse the characters questioned didn't see his killer. Now, I don't personally think every dead body the party questions should know nothing. Like, there are more elegant ways to handle mysteries in D&D. But I've never felt that much need to ban Speak with Dead. In fact, there are some times when I really hope the players cast it, because it's going to give me a good excuse to give them some specific exposition that really only the victim could give them. Next, let's talk about the summoning spells. These are the spells like Conjure Animals, Conjure Woodland Beings, Conjure Elemental, that sort of thing. At this point in the lifespan of 5th edition, it seems like nobody likes these spells. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything provided much better equivalents to these spells, and the designers behind D&D have made it clear that these spells are something that they wanted to revise in the new edition of the game that's coming out in just a couple of months from now. The primary issues with these spells are twofold. First, even the act of casting these spells is a lot of extra work for the players and the GMs. After all, the descriptions of these spells don't include a complete list of creatures you can summon. At best, they might give you a couple of examples, if they even offer anything at all. So either the player has to get their hands on the monster manual, or the GM has to provide a list to the players of the creatures these players can conjure. But the other major issue with these spells is how much they slow down combat. D&D combat already moves slowly enough with 4 or 5 players handling pretty intricate characters, but once you add 8 wolves to the battlefield, you can pretty much forget any chance of decent pacing, because the druid who summoned 8 wolves has to roll 8 attacks now. Oh, and because the wolves have pack tactics, a lot of them are going to get advantage on their attacks. So that's 16 rolls from one player. That's not even including whatever they might be doing with their own turn. Weirdly, the best way I found for the other players not to get agitated by the inflated initiative lists was to run a game for 4 druids. When everyone in the party can summon 8 wolves or 8 velociraptors, everybody's pretty understanding if only one player does so and then has to make a whole bunch of rolls on their turn. Using a VTT also helps because it can automate a lot of these rolls, which helps save a ton of time. But that being said, we did still have a problem with these spells in our game, because of course we did. Now, rules as written, the players don't choose what creatures get conjured, the GM does. And that can be a great way to manage some of the wild stuff your players want to do. After all, if you don't give them 8 wolves or 8 velociraptors, then the creature's attacks won't be rolled at advantage, which does help save time and cuts down on a lot of the bookkeeping. But I don't know about you, but I have enough to deal with at the table without also choosing what creatures the characters summon. But in the game I ran for 4 druids, who were all constantly summoning things in every fight, I pretty much had to start deciding what animals they summoned. And it wasn't because they were screwing with my encounter difficulty, but because the players were getting bored. They started to wonder how they were getting away with using summoning spells in every fight, making almost a dozen velociraptors each, and swarming the enemies with tiny dinosaurs. I could see that they knew it was the smartest tactical move, but the entertainment value had started to wear off. So I told them, okay, in the description of these spells, these are actually Fey spirits you're bringing over, and they're simply taking the form of animals you're familiar with. But Fey are famously unruly. That's kind of their whole thing. So if you keep summoning in every fight, eventually they're going to take issue with this. And so from then on, they had to roll a die every time they summoned creatures. Whatever number they rolled, that's how many creatures manifested in the forms that the caster had requested. So let's say a player summons 8 wolves. They roll a d8 and they get a 5. Therefore, they get 5 wolves. As for the other 3, I would pick from the list of available animals. Either I'd randomly roll some dice, or I'd just point somewhere on the list, or I would actually choose one that seemed funny, like a camel or whatever. The bigger issue with the spell was how my players were able to completely dominate a combat before it had even really begun. Some ogres are lumbering toward you. Well, you don't have to run up against them to fight them. You can summon velociraptors around those ogres. Those creatures can go to town on the ogres and force the ogres to either fight the raptors instead of fighting you, or keep moving towards you and get obliterated by opportunity attacks. The heroes were never in any danger anymore. And then when you factor Healing Spirit into the equation, the little bit of damage they did take, they could almost immediately recover from. So I can absolutely understand why you might ban these summoning spells. Clearly the designers of the game have been trying to reckon with them as well. But I'm actually glad that I didn't, because trying to solve this problem actually led me to creating one of my favorite fights in the entire campaign. I'll probably make another video pretty soon about that fight, because I don't have time to discuss it in this video in any detail, but I was trying to make a fight where summoning spells couldn't solve the problem. And as a result, the players also wound up in a tense situation where they had to cast Healing Spirit as it was intended, in the middle of a challenging encounter. Does that mean that this was the right approach for every game that I ran? No, definitely not. I'm very happy that the designers have kept working on a better version of summoning spells for the new books, but I don't regret allowing it in my games, if that makes any sense. Next, let's talk about Remove Curse, because this is kind of a big one for me, as somebody who is currently running up a couple of Curse of Strahd campaigns. Because there are a few very understandable reasons to ban this spell. First, the Remove Curse spell is actively at odds with how curses work in the stories that inspire our adventures. A curse is meant to feel like a big deal, not something you can simply say some words over and get cleared up right away. And when you try to make some of these curses have the narrative impact they're supposed to, you functionally have to make them immune to the Remove Curse spell. For example, in my campaigns, lycanthropy can't be solved by a Remove Curse spell, because if it could, then getting bitten by a werewolf is a lot less dramatic and dangerous. The other major reason to ban the spell is that including it in your games means you really can't curse your party members with lasting effects. Now that attitude feels like it drifts towards the adversarial sometimes. I doubt that's how a GM would think of it, and maybe that's not even how the players would feel about it, but I think that would be a risk. But also, I probably feel that way because I don't inflict curses on my player characters very often. But I don't inflict curses on them very often because the spell Remove Curse makes them functionally irrelevant. In fact, I wish curses were a bigger part of my game sometimes. But as it stands, you can really only get any mileage out of curses if you cast them on players who are 1st through 4th level, because once they hit 5th level, Remove Curse enters the chat. But the nice thing about inflicting curses on lower level characters is that they have to find a way to remove the curse themselves. And that usually means going on some sort of quest to track down whatever components they might need, and or find somebody capable of lifting the curse in exchange for a favor. Basically, going through the effort of trying to remove a curse can lead to new adventures. Even if you keep Remove Curse in the game and allow some NPCs to be able to cast it, the players still need to either scrounge up enough money to pay for the curse to be lifted, or again, maybe they have to do some sort of sketchy favor for the caster. And then, when the players actually get access to Remove Curse themselves, it actually does feel like they've made some substantial progress and gained a lot of power. But only if they've had to deal with curses in some form or another at lower levels. But that still leaves the fact that there are only 4 levels of the game where curses are going to feel impactful in any way. As it stands, it seems like the most balanced and fun version of the Remove Curse spell is treated as the counterpart to Bestow Curse. The same way Dispel Magic is really intended to target spells that have been cast rather than magic items or magical creatures. However, once again, I don't know about you, but my NPCs don't tend to cast Bestow Curse very often. And so you might want to tell your players, hey, just so you know, Remove Curse isn't going to work on things like lycanthropy or vampirism. It only works when somebody else casts Bestow Curse. So just know that when you take the spell. Of course, that is essentially a soft ban on the spell. Now, I'm not necessarily sold on fully removing Remove Curse from my games, but I might want to tinker with it a bit. For example, maybe you can only cast the spell once you have some specific material components to tackle that type of curse. Or maybe casting Remove Curse just tells you what's required to lift the curse.
All the scattered pieces of the Aztec gold must be restored, and the blood repaid.
I learned that if you stab the heart, yours must take its place.
Water from the fountain and a mermaid's tear?
And 2 silver chalices, 1 cup with a tear, 1 without.
The trident of Poseidon can break your curse.
Okay, and how does everybody know all these very specific curse rules? I don't know. Maybe when you get cursed, it comes with an instruction manual.
So Remove Curse isn't a spell I've banned before, but it is often on the bubble. Generally speaking, I don't like taking cool toys away from the players. And there's also the shoot your monks principle to consider. You know, if somebody learns Remove Curse, include a few curses for them to remove. It makes things more fun for them. But again, the issue here is that curses being lifted by a single spell you can just cast as an action just feels really incongruous with how we imagine curses to work in fiction and folklore. So remove curse, you're basically on notice. We're going to see if you've changed in the 2024 rules, and then we might address you on a case-by-case basis for future 5e campaigns. But that wasn't the spell I was talking about in the introduction when I said that there's a spell I kinda ban in my games. We'll get there soon. Next, let's discuss the resurrection spells. Specifically, we've got Revivify, Raise Dead, and Resurrection, and maybe True Resurrection. The argument here is that death still needs to be on the table in order for your D&D games to have stakes. Something that I generally kind of agree with, but I think we can make exceptions. I've talked about that before. But some of the people who believe that death needs to be an option in D&D also feel that it really undercuts those stakes if you can cast a spell to easily reverse death. It also, once again, doesn't fit with the fantasy of the game, since fantasy stories and myths often involve some real cost to coming back from the dead, to say nothing of the challenges in bringing the dead back to life in the first place. Now, some folks only ban the higher level spells, but they keep Revivify, basically treating it like a fantasy defibrillator. Others ban most of these, but maybe don't touch True Resurrection because 9th level spells should be really powerful, and so having one that allows you to raise the dead makes a lot of sense. Now, I've made a few videos about character death, and so you can check out that playlist, it's in the link below, to see how I handle death in my games, and how I take different approaches depending on the campaign that I'm running. But I don't tend to ban any of these spells. And again, I could say it's because getting this power helps players feel like they're gaining more power over the world of the game, which is true. I could also say that it's because I run very plot-focused games, and resurrection spells allow us to keep our focus on the player-focused storylines, rather than dropping important plots after the relevant character dies. And that's also true. But quite frankly, the reason I don't ban these spells is the same reason that D&D introduced these spells in the first place. They get your players playing again quickly, playing the same characters they already love. Now, once again, there are definitely ways to make these spells more dramatic, or make death have more weight, some of which I've discussed before. But as with any major change you're making to the fundamental expectations that your players have from the game, you need to give them a heads up that death is going to work differently this time, because they need to know that. Now, you might have noticed that when I listed off these resurrection-related spells, I didn't include reincarnation in that list. That's because you can have reincarnation when you pry it from my cold dead hands. It's my favorite spell in the game. You're not touching it. Next on our list is Charm Monster, a spell I've seen pop up a few times on the list of banned spells. Because obviously Charm Monster can end a fight pretty quickly, especially if they're facing off against just one big monster. But also, look, I keep saying this, but this is fun for these players. And when it starts to get less fun for them, if they start to feel like it robs the fight of tension, they'll probably stop doing it. Or at the very least, you'll be able to see that they don't enjoy it, and you'll be able to adjust future encounters to make sure that a single spell can't have that same impact anymore. And what happens if the players actually charm the final boss? Well, look, if that actually does solve the problem, then the final boss probably wasn't all that evil. Because if the boss really was so evil, I don't imagine the players would put so much energy into charming them rather than killing them. And Charm Person and Charm Monster are not mind control. The villain isn't just going to give up their cause because they now like one of the heroes, especially if they are not the kind of character who is going to listen to reason at all. I have a video coming out later this week, hopefully Sunday, about making your villains more unreasonable. Or I guess, less reasonable. So keep an eye out for that, it's actually going to be one of my best videos ever. But on the subject of Charm Monster, it doesn't have to be the end of the fight. Because you can and probably should construct your finales so that even when the final boss is out of the picture, that doesn't mean that the adventure is over. This is useful advice anyway, just because final boss fights are impossible to balance because you don't get a chance to test them. So there is a very real chance that your villain will get struck down really quickly. And this is not a piece of advice I put into practice very often. I do tend to hang a lot of my adventures on a big final boss fight, but I could definitely stand to include more ticking clocks in my finales. That way when the players pull shenanigans that take the boss out of commission super quickly, they aren't robbing the entire session of tension. Next up is Polymorph. I'm honestly kind of surprised that people ban Polymorph. This spell rules. Again, it's extremely powerful, but that's a good thing. Players like feeling powerful. You can let them have those awesome moments. I also think people forget to roll concentration checks a lot when somebody is polymorphed into like a giant ape or a T-Rex or something, especially if the group is much more used to dealing with wild shapes at their tables. But I actually think that as long as you remember that any damage they take triggers a concentration check, Polymorph really isn't all that bad. I don't have a ton more to say about it, so we're moving on. Next, we're covering fast travel spells, specifically Teleportation Circle and Teleport, though we can include Transport via plants in this as well. These spells can present a huge challenge for GMs who have to stay on their toes during mid to high level games where the players could potentially go anywhere in the world at any time thanks to these spells. But perhaps surprisingly, I often see these banned for lore reasons. You know, people say things like, long-range teleportation magic doesn't work in my homebrew world. Sometimes that is motivated by the demands of the adventure. For example, Curse of Straw does not allow major teleportation or plane shift spells to be cast in Barovia because otherwise people could escape the valley, and that's impossible. But it seems like that's not always why this happens. I played in a home game where the GM setting had no long-range teleportation magic. But not only was that the case because of lore reasons, but those reasons were actually based on the events of a previous game he had run for a different group in the same setting. Something his players had done in some previous game had broken teleportation spells. Also, he made sure to tell us that before the campaign even started. Good work, GM. Great example of what we've been talking about today. If at any point you're running an adventure or running a setting where you need to ban a spell, I get it. I try not to do this myself, but I'm also really familiar with these teleportation spells, so it's much easier for me to make adventures that can't get ruined by a single one of these when those spells live rent-free in my head. I think about Teleportation Circle and Teleport all the time. And not just when I'm prepping an adventure, but even when I'm building a world. I think about how far away things are and what content will become open to the players once they get access to these kinds of spells. That's just how my brain works, I guess. And now let's talk about the big kahuna. Wish. Wish is the most powerful spell in the game. Not only does it allow you to cast any other spell in the game, but you can also, make a wish. And the consequence of that could have a huge impact on the world of the game. As a friend of mine once said when my wizard got access to Wish, it was like sitting at the table with someone who could jump in and be the GM at any point. This spell obviously has some restrictions, so while it is extremely powerful, it doesn't actually take away the agency or authority of the GM. But that doesn't mean that everyone is comfortable with Wish being cast at their tables. But I think about this spell all the time too. I actually want to give my players a wish sometimes, because I think that's fun. I haven't gotten the chance yet, but I've got some campaign ideas that would potentially involve the characters getting access to a wish, or even a couple of wishes, before they ever reach this level where they would actually take the spell when they leveled up. That being said, for some GMs, the issue is the fact that you can just get access to wish once you level up enough times. Yes, it's a 9th level spell, and those are supposed to be the most powerful ones in the game. They're meant to make you feel like a god walking among mortals. And yes, it happens at 17th level, which a lot of games never hit, so this is maybe a moot point in a lot of ways. But we also can't deny the fact that, once again, wishes might be common in fantasy and adventure stories, but they're also usually supposed to be a pretty big deal. They're either falling into your lap through a happenstance or destiny, or the characters must undertake a great quest to get access to a wish. So for some GMs, it just does not feel right to get a wish by simply leveling up. After all, where is the drama and mystery and majesty of getting access to a wish if it happens off camera while you level up? But this is kind of an issue of leveling up not being dramatic, or not being dramatized at the table. Truthfully, we very rarely ask our players to explain where they got all their cool stuff when they leveled up. It's something that I wish I would do more often, but it just doesn't necessarily match how everybody plays the game, so if your players are not totally on board with it, it could do more than just slow down play. It could actively take people out of their comfort zone. That being said, I don't think it would be the end of the world to ask players for an explanation of how they got their hands on the wish spell specifically. Why do I feel like it makes more sense for that spell than it does for any others? Because it is the most powerful spell in the game. But generally speaking, like with a lot of other examples so far, I don't ban this spell at my tables, and I kind of wish more people would cast Wish. I did that on purpose, but there is a spell that has such a heinous reputation and is the center of so much discourse in the community, it has probably become the most banned spell in the game. And I kind of ban it too. Let's talk about Silvery Barbs. First of all, Silvery Barbs is optional content. You don't have to allow your players to use any of the player options from Strixhaven, let alone this spell. Normally I don't even mention the fact that whatever we are banning is actually optional content, but in this case, it's extremely relevant. Because quite frankly, I rarely see anybody who takes Silvery Barbs using any of the other player options from the Strixhaven book. Now I would honestly be interested in giving Silvery Barbs a chance in a straight up Strixhaven game. Because to be honest, my issue with the spell has very little to do with how powerful it is. Yes, it's obviously an incredibly powerful spell, especially for first level. Yes, I think it's probably broken. A better version of the spell would either not be quite as powerful or not be as high level. But that's not why I limit the use of it in my games. My issue with the spell is that it is so good and so powerful, players feel like they have no choice but to take it.
That will have a 25 to hit.
How do we feel about a Silvery Barb situation?
This one that was called to attack you is going to try and strike you again from behind.
Great.
Natural 20.
I would love to Silvery Barbs. So stupid. We all have telepathy. We all have Silvery Barbs.
I know what we didn't.
I promise we didn't talk to each other.
That's the problem is we didn't talk to each other,
funny.
and that's why we all chose the thing that made sense.
Now, like I said, the power level is not the issue. Matt was still able to find a way to challenge these players in battle, so I don't think it's too powerful to allow in our games. But it is considered to be too good not to use, and that's something I really don't like. Whenever there's a spell that's so good it's regarded as the right answer, I think that's just bad design. I don't mind things being unbalanced in D&D because different aspects of the game should provide different experiences and fulfill different core fantasies. Wizards are much more powerful than fighters, but if somebody wants to play a fighter, then they can absolutely still have fun doing that, even though they are objectively less powerful than some other characters. But I have seen so many players take Silvery Barbs not because it fulfills some sort of class fantasy or helps capture the character they have in their heads. They take it because it's powerful. And there's nothing wrong with building a powerful character. But if your goal is to build a powerful character and it feels like the only logical choice is to take this spell, then you weren't really given a choice at all. That being said, I don't fully ban this spell from my games. If somebody really wants Silvery Barbs, I tell them they can take it if they take a feat that would give them access to it. For example, if they take the Magic Initiate feat to get access to some wizard spells, I'm totally fine with one of those spells being Silvery Barbs. So the spell is not difficult to come by in my games, but at the very least, it requires them to make a choice about their character. It requires some amount of effort. But I have had so many players ask about taking Silvery Barbs. I think the reason they feel like they have to ask permission isn't just because it's from a non-core product. They don't ask permission for any other spells. And it's not just because I play with a lot of polite people, although I definitely do. I think they ask about Silvery Barbs because they tend to feel like they're, again, getting away with something when they cast it. They want to make sure that I know they're taking the spell, that I know what I'm signing up for by letting them take it. Because that is not a fun spell to have dropped on you when you don't know it's coming, especially from a first level character. In my next 5e game, we'll probably be playing with just the rules from the new core rulebook, so when I tell my players that, there's probably a good chance that will put an end to the discussion around Silvery Barbs. Although I do think it would be fun to grant access to spells from other books and products through spell scrolls and spell books, which could help them feel like it's a bit of forbidden knowledge the players are discovering. And who knows, maybe some Strixhaven spells will find their way into my games through that method. We'll see what happens. Now, these are all the spells that I've seen people discuss banning, but I am sure that I have missed some that have come up in your own travels through our community. So let me know in the comments below. Are there any other spells that you've seen GMs ban that I didn't cover today? How do you feel about the spells that we did talk about today? Are they banned at your tables? If you're mainly a player, how do you feel when your GM bans a spell? Do they have these conversations with your group in session 0? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Your support really helps a lot, especially months like this where it never gets below 80 degrees where I live, so I have to run the AC all the time so my baby and my dogs don't burst into flames. Consider signing up for my Discord server to hang out with other awesome people, and sign up for my mailing list. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. Click here to check out my video where I take a little tour through the Dungeon Master's Guide covers of the past. That was a really fun video to make. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.